Did you know that Charles Dickens wrote a twist on Bluebeard called Captain Murderer? It's very melodramatic and very silly, and I'm sharing it with you now.
Grab yourself some beers and cover up the kids' ears. It's grown-ass story time with Liz. Bring!
Once there was a man whose literal name was Captain Murderer. Despite this rather horrifying name, he was quite popular in high society. And he never suffered for lack of companionship. In fact, he was constantly getting married. But that could be because he was also constantly murdering his wives. This is how it would go down. Each time Captain Murderer was wed, he'd have rare, exotic flowers planted up the path to his house. As he'd escort his new bride home, she would often comment on these flowers. "Dear Captain Murderer, I've never seen such flowers. Please, tell me about them." And Captain Murderer would twirl his mustache and reply, "They are garnish for my lamb." As Captain Murderer guffawed at his own cryptic joke, his wife would notice how sharp his teeth looked. And as he removed the bridles and harnesses from their fine white horses, Mrs. Murderer would also notice that they were spotted with blood. The newlyweds would then live in peace for a bit, but a month and a day out from the marriage, Captain Murderer would finish his wicked plot. He would bring out a golden pie plate and a silver rolling pin. "My darling, I would love for you to bake me a pie." Now, of course, Mrs. Murderer would be happy to do so, and she would conveniently find all of the ingredients and tools she needed to bake the pie already laid out. All the ingredients except for one. "Why, what kind of pie is this to be, darling?" And Captain Murderer would twirl his mustache and reply, "Why, a meat pie, of course." "But my darling, it seems you have forgotten the meat." "Or have I?" And then Captain Murderer would draw his sword and point it at his wife and order her to bake the pie. By now, Captain Murderer's wives were getting the idea that all was not well in the Murderer household. They'd usually begin crying, salting their pie dough with their tears. When time came to make the filling, they would ask, "But husband, we have no meat." That is when Captain Murderer would take his wife's elbow and lead her to the mirror. "Why, the meat is right there in the glass." And as his wife took in her own reflection, Captain Murderer would slice off her head. Then he'd process his wife's meat into the pie, send it off to the baker for baking, eat the wife pie, and pick his teeth with her bones. Horrifying violence aside, you gotta admit, this guy has some style. Now, Captain Murderer did not win over everyone in town. A young pair of twin sisters were the next ladies that Captain Murderer had his eye on. One was fair of hair and the other dark. The blonde had taken a liking to the captain, but the brunette had his number. When Captain Murderer proposed to the blonde sister, the brunette begged her not to go through with the marriage. But alas, the poor girl did, and found herself to be the next person pie. But by now the brunette twin had figured out the pattern in Captain Murderer's love life. Though she couldn't prevent her sister from being led to the slaughter, she did everything she could to spy on Captain Murderer leading up to her sister's death. She caught the captain having his teeth filed by his personal blacksmith one night and shuddered. She worked out that the captain's marriages all lasted about the same amount of time. And she learned about the pie that he regularly dined on when his wife had died, and she put two and two together. One day she marched right up to the door of Captain Murderer and knocked. When he answered, she smiled beguilingly. "Captain Murderer, I think you should take me to wed. I was so jealous when you married my sister, you know." This flattered the captain, and he agreed to her proposal. A month and a day after their marriage, the captain asked the brunette to bake her pie casket. He was surprised when she not only agreed to the task, but did so with a wicked chuckle. He noticed that she didn't ask him about the meat filling. "Aren't you wondering where the meat is?" "I figured you'd show me when it was time." Captain Murderer grabbed her elbow and dragged her to the mirror, getting impatient. "The meat is right there in the glass. Get it?" The captain was disturbed to see the pretty brunette keeping eye contact with him as she looked in the mirror. And she laughed at his distress, still holding his gaze. Quickly, he sliced off her head to kill her, and to kill the weird vibe she was giving off. And he baked her into the pie. But what he did not know was that just before she sat down to bake him his pie, his wife had consumed poison of the wickedest variety. Captain Murderer ate up his brunette pie greedily. But as he picked his teeth with the girl's bones, he noticed in the mirror that his face was swelling over his collar. He approached the mirror and saw not only that, but that his complexion was turning blue. Captain Murderer kept swelling and changing in hue. He screamed in agony as his buttons burst and his skin stretched. He kept swelling and screaming until his fingertips brushed each side of the room and his head brushed the top of the ceiling. And with one final scream, the old bastard exploded! The noise was so loud and horrifying that the captain's horses in the stable reared up and they got loose and they trampled everyone in the captain's household to death. And that is how Captain Murderer became Captain Murdered.